Hi, my name is Ken Bowser, and this video is a response to Chris Brennan's critique of the September 2025 New York Times article, Your Zodiac Sign is 2,000 Years Out of Date. Chris notes that similar articles have appeared several times in the past 15 years, which he described as an attempt to discredit astrology. But there's a reason this issue keeps popping up over and over. It's no secret that the zodiac, which is available to anyone who cares to look at the night sky, is completely disconnected from the tropical signs. That discrepancy quite naturally evokes the question, why do astrologers dismiss the matter as a non-issue? Chris explains his way out of that conundrum, but I take issue with quite a lot of what he said. In this video, I will respond to the most important points.
The zodiac was first developed especially by tracking the movement of the moon and the planets, which look like wandering stars in the sky, as they would move against the backdrop of the other stars in the sky that are fixed and don't move. So basically, if you go out over a successive number of nights over a long period of time and look at the fixed stars each night, you'll see some stars that always stay in the same place. But over time, you'll see some little stars that actually move against the other stars. And what they realized eventually is that the stars that move were the planets. And that's actually what the Greek word planetes meant originally, was wandering star or like moving star. So originally, the Babylonians or the Mesopotamian astronomers and astrologers identified different constellations and different groupings of fixed stars that formed different patterns in the night sky. And there was a number of different constellations that they identified of unequal size that the planets and the moon and the sun would move through over the course of different periods of time. So this is what is known as the constellational zodiac, which is a zodiac that is just the path that the sun and moon and the other planets move through over a period of time, because it turns out that the planets and the sun and moon, they don't actually deviate from this very specific path through the sky, but instead there's a specific path that they always move through. And that path is what we call the zodiac, or that's part of the definition of the zodiac and the ecliptic, which is that it's the path that the planets move through in the sky and don't deviate from. So when you're just defining it like that, the constellational zodiac is just whatever parts of different constellations the planets move through as they move through the path known as the ecliptic. And there were at least 17 or more different constellations, or like parts of constellations, that the planets would move through over the course of their different planetary periods. Eventually, by the 5th century BCE, the Mesopotamians standardized the zodiac signs to consist of 12 signs of exactly 30 degrees each.
In the section on the zodiac, Chris chose his words very carefully. He said that the Babylonians identified, then developed, and finally standardized the zodiac without mentioning the word associated with their renown in the ancient world. They discovered and mapped out the zodiac, which is the reference used today that's based on the plane of the ecliptic. The ecliptic is the center line of the zodiac. The celestial equator, which is the terrestrial equator, extended out into space, was the common frame of reference throughout most of the world, even in China, before the Babylonians incorporated ecliptic emphasis as the central theme of their astrological corpus. The transfer of emphasis to the ecliptic, which became the basis of the zodiac, has earned the praise of historians of science as one of the greatest technical achievements of antiquity. The zodiac has some Sumerian influence, and the Egyptians took into account the entire sky from horizon to pole. But it was the Babylonians who rendered earlier astronomical reckoning into the main instrument, the zodiac, that astrologers rely on to interpret the correspondence between the sky and the ground. The zodiac is a 100% sidereal achievement. The Greeks had no hand whatsoever in mapping out the ecliptic and systematically organizing the sky. It was an enormous Babylonian undertaking that took many centuries to complete. The Greeks adopted the Babylonian zodiac intact, lock, stock, and barrel. One could easily get the impression from what Chris said that the Babylonians had only recently dropped Orion, Perseus, Auriga, Pegasus, and the swallow, incorporated the two fish of Pisces into one sign, and made Perseus part of Taurus in the 5th century BCE. Nobody knows exactly when that happened, doubtless because it happened gradually. But there's good evidence that the 12-fold equal division format was already a tradition by the time of Esarhaddon, who reigned in Assyria and Babylon from 681 to 669 BCE. It's misleading to assert that it happened suddenly. The 12-fold equal division sidereal zodiac did not appear out of thin air, fully formed like Athena from the head of Zeus.
Right away, by standardizing the zodiac, it's partially bringing it into alignment with the Mesopotamian calendar, and it starts to become an abstract division of 12 segments of the sky, fundamentally, rather than something that is fully aligned with the constellations. Because one of the issues with the constellational zodiac is that the constellations are unequal in size. So there's some constellations like Virgo that are very big, and there's other constellations like Cancer, for example, that are much smaller. Already once you go from the constellational zodiac to the sidereal zodiac, that's 12 signs of exactly 30 degrees each, you're starting to create a construct that has more symbolic significance rather than something that's purely being based on mapping things to the stars exactly one for one. And it's also moving it in the direction of being aligned partially with the seasons and the different seasons that happen, especially in the northern hemisphere, like spring, summer, autumn, and winter.
Chris states that the sidereal zodiac became part of the Babylonian calendar in the 5th century. Actually, the Babylonian calendar was tied to the zodiac from at least the 8th century. One can know that from Mul Apen, the major Babylonian astronomical compendium laid out before the 8th century BCE. According to Mul Apen, the civil year began when the moon was observed in sidereal Aries on the first or second day after the new moon closest to the vernal equinox, either before or after it. Chris casts aspersions on the sidereal signs as mere abstractions, as if they're not invested with merit. He doesn't mention the most important things about the sidereal signs. You can see them in the night sky, and they don't move. Chris claims that the sidereal zodiac is partially aligned to the seasons. That's not true. The sidereal signs were never aligned to the seasons, even when tropical and sidereal reckoning were briefly aligned in the 3rd century CE. Many people automatically assume when they see this word equinox that equinox means tropical reckoning, but it's just a marker, not an astrological fiducial. The Babylonians always noted the equinox, but didn't reckon celestial longitude from it, which is absolutely clear from their ephemerides, which were uniformly sidereal. Chris may be talking about systems A and B, which correspond to 501 BCE and 358 BCE, respectively, that were accurate for an equinox of 10 Aries and 8 Aries. They were used in the Greco-Roman world long after they had become inaccurate. The point is that the equinox was described in terms of sidereal reckoning during the era that preceded tropical reckoning, not that it was a point of reference for planets in the Babylonian sidereal context.
For all intents and purposes, Hellenistic astrology acts as the foundation of all of Western astrology over the past 2,000 years. That all of the different subsequent traditions of astrology, especially in the West, have been different variations of the basic system that was created around the 2nd century BCE in Hellenistic Egypt.
Chris claims that Hellenistic astrology is the foundation of astrology of the last 2,000 years. That's a gross overstatement. The zodiac itself, discovered by the Babylonians, is the backbone and the foundation of astrology.
System of Western astrology develops around this time, around the second century BCE. And although it's taking some concepts from the earlier Mesopotamian and Egyptian and other astrological traditions, fundamentally there are some new concepts that are being introduced at this time as well. So one of the concepts that seems to have been introduced around this time is the concept of the so-called domicile scheme of assigning each of the seven traditional planets to one or two of the signs of the zodiac. So, for example, the sun and the moon were assigned to Cancer and Leo because those are the two signs that follow after the summer solstice, which is the hottest and the brightest part of the year in the northern hemisphere. So you assign the two luminaries, or the two planets that provide light, and in the case of the sun, heat. So there's a symbolic resonance there, and a motivation for assigning the two luminaries to those two signs of the zodiac. After that, you assign Mercury to the two signs that are flanking the sun and the moon, which are Virgo and Gemini. Virgo and Gemini. Then after that, you move on to the next planet that is the furthest from that, moving outwards after Mercury, which is Venus, which gets assigned to Libra and to Taurus. Then the next furthest and slowest planet is Mars, so it gets assigned to Scorpio and Aries. Then Jupiter is the next furthest planet that gets assigned to Sagittarius and Pisces. And finally, Saturn is the last visible traditional planet in ancient times, and it gets assigned to Capricorn and Aquarius. So what's important about this scheme that's crucial for our understanding is that this scheme, one, becomes part of the motivation for why astrologers associate certain things with certain zodiac signs.
Chris emphasizes Greek domicile schemes as a prime example of Greek schematism, which is a substitute for the actual zodiac. The domicile schematism ignores the stars and focuses on northern hemisphere weather, which doesn't apply in the southern hemisphere. The domicile schemes began the usurpation of the names of the sidereal signs. The adoption by Ptolemy and subsequent tropical advocates of the names of the sidereal signs is the reason behind the appearance of the New York Times article. Such articles are entirely reasonable because tropical zodiac placements are artificial and have nothing to do with the sky.
There's other concepts such as the exaltation signs, which also recently some historical evidence has shown were also derived ultimately from considerations that were more connected with the seasons rather than the stars.
The idea that the exaltations are more connected to the seasons than the sky is extremely misleading, because the exaltations that deal with the planets are explicitly sidereal and Babylonian. Chris may have brought up the issue of the origin of the exaltations due to the appearance of a recently published article in the Journal for the History of Astronomy by Professor Matthew Ossendriver entitled The Exaltations of Greco-Roman Astrology and Their Relationship to Babylonian Normal Star Positions. Ossendriver writes on page 2, quote, since the cuneiform evidence for places of secrecy predates the Greco-Roman exaltations, there is no doubt that the latter were derived from the former. End quote. The secret places from Bit Nasirti in Akkadian are the places where planets have their greatest power. In other words, the exaltations of the planets are all sidereal. They don't translate into tropical positions of the same name, and they came long before the Greeks had developed any facility with astrology beyond farmers' lore.
Astrologers were drawing on elements of both, and for the most part, most astrologers don't actually seem to have been aware of precession because it was a relatively new scientific concept that hadn't been widely acknowledged at that point. But all of that was to change because Going back to the second century BCE, there was a famous astronomer named Hipparchus, a Greek astronomer, who discovered precession and who discovered that the fundamentally the tropical signs of the zodiac were drifting away from the sidereal zodiac signs of the zodiac, and he thought it was happening at a rate of about 1 degree every 100 years.
Chris says that for the most part, astrologers were not aware of precession, which is true, but an extreme understatement. But farther along in this video, he says repeatedly that astrologers were completely aware of precession, which overstates their knowledge of it. Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE determined that there was a very slow, long-term movement between the ecliptic and the celestial equator, whereby they would eventually be in different positions with respect to each other than the positions of his day. Hipparchus didn't know what caused the change between his own time and an observation 150 years older, or whether the movement was in the equator or the ecliptic. In other words, he wasn't sure if the movement was caused by the Earth or the movement of the sky as a unit. Professor Gerald Toomer, who translated Ptolemy's Almagest, thinks that Hipparchus was the one who could think outside the box. And toward the end of his career, that he at least suspected that it was the equator that was moving, which is correct. That means the precessional motion that Hipparchus and Ptolemy observed was due to the change in the orientation of the Earth's equator with respect to the sky, not actual movement of the sky. Ptolemy was having none of that argument 300 years later. His comment in the Almagest with regard to the motion of the equator versus the ecliptic was that Hipparchus was confused. Chris states that Hipparchus thought that the rate of precession was 1 degree per century, but that's not correct. It was Ptolemy who determined that the rate was 1 degree per century. Hipparchus's estimate was much closer to the truth. The rate that Hipparchus determined was 1 degree in 78.3 years, approximately 300 years before Ptolemy. The correct value is 1 degree every 71.6 years.
Basically, Ptolemy was able to confirm precession. And then by that point, he also had to make a choice, or he realized that you had to make a choice then when you were doing astrology in terms of whether you were going to use the sidereal zodiac or the tropical zodiac as a result of this issue and this slow moving out of alignment of the two zodiacs. So in Ptolemy's work, to make a long story short, for the purpose of astrology, Ptolemy adopted the tropical zodiac associated with the seasons because he thought that that was both conceptually, he thought that that was conceptually what most of the meanings of the zodiac signs were based on. And he also believed that to be the intention of the earlier founders of Hellenistic astrology going back to the 2nd century BCE.
Chris repeatedly claims that Ptolemy made a clear and deliberate choice between tropical and sidereal reckoning, but that's impossible to defend. Ptolemy explicitly stated in the Almagest that the Earth is without any motion of any kind, fixed in space in the center of the universe. He explicitly wrote the rotation of the Earth on its axis is impossible because everything not tied down would fly off. If your premise is that the Earth is absolutely motionless, with no rotation on its axis, and certainly no revolution about the sun nor movement among the stars, and you detect motion between the Earth and the stars, you're forced to conclude that any motion between the equator and the ecliptic has to be in the ecliptic and not the equator. There is no way around that, and it absolutely precludes any sort of choice. Actually, the ecliptic, as a practical matter, taken as a whole, is very close to being fixed. The ecliptic moves by less than a half second of arc per year, which is imperceptible then and now without exceedingly fine instruments. Whereas the equator moves 50.23 seconds of arc per year, which is breakneck speed in astronomical terms and entirely perceptible. 50.23 seconds of arc amounts to 20 minutes and 24 seconds of time. That's the amount of annual precession and the difference between tropical and sidereal reckoning, which adds up to more than an hour at age 3, 2 hours by age 6, more than 3 hours by age 9, and so on. There could be no possible choice between tropical and sidereal reckoning if one accepts as the gospel truth that the Earth is absolutely fixed and by extension the equator. By insisting that the motion Hipparchus saw and Ptolemy confirmed was in the ecliptic and not the equator, Ptolemy founded a system built on a false premise that was not just a little off, but diametrically opposite basic facts of solar system geometry. Ptolemy got it backwards. Hipparchus was right, if indeed he did suspect that precession was caused by movement in the celestial equator. One of the results of getting it backwards is that tropical reckoning doesn't track. Rather, it gets out of sync with the sky at the rate of precession, which is why tropical transits don't mirror the sky in era-to-era comparisons. It also means that tropical reckoning confounds figure and ground. They're reversed by Ptolemaic reasoning. It's like saying that the train backs into the station, or the cyclist is moving in place as the world passes him by. Ptolemy can be excused for not having available critical knowledge of the configuration of the solar system, but to persist in his mistake begs the issue of how far that can be taken in the face of the facts. It explains further why Chris overstates the matter with regard to a general understanding of precession. The only thing that was grasped by some people was that something was moving, but nobody knew how, why, or what was causing it, which gave rise to at least another unfounded and incorrect explanation of the matter called trepidation. Trepidation was advanced after Ptolemy's death as an oscillation of the ecliptic. Chris states that Ptolemy adopted the tropical zodiac because, for one thing, he believed it to be the intention of the people who developed Hellenistic astrology in the 2nd century BCE. My problem with that is that Vettius Valens, the major astrological figure of the 2nd century CE in the West, wasn't using tropical reckoning. Neugebauer and Van Hersen, in their Greek horoscopes, go so far as to say that Vettius Valens, a contemporary of Ptolemy, who some people think may have died in the same year, approximately 175 CE, used sidereal reckoning when he used signs with degrees. Since Valens's compendium of charts is not tropical, and he was a notably conscientious and devoted astrologer, the issue of when tropical reckoning actually gained currency in the real world is debatable. Moreover, Hipparchus, who was working 300 years before Valens, was not a friend of astrology, and his frame of reference was right ascension and declination. At least that's what he used to determine that Spica, the alpha star in Virgo the Virgin, was 2 degrees farther to the east of the autumnal equinox in his own time than it had been in the time of Timocharis, another Greek who observed the star 150 years before Hipparchus's time. What Hipparchus observed was the equinox moving to the west with respect to the sky. It was Hipparchus's observations of Spica and Regulus that demonstrated precession.
So this is really important because it means that astrologers have been aware of precession for 2,000 years now, that astrologers, at least starting with Ptolemy, if not earlier, started making a conscious choice once precession, the reality of precession became known, that astrologers, at least as early as Ptolemy, started making the choice to deliberately use the tropical zodiac, and that this wasn't like an accidental thing, that this was like a deliberate choice that was being done of their own personal volition, based on what they thought made the most conceptual sense based on the different motivations of the astrological techniques.
Chris insists many times that astrologers were making a conscious decision to choose tropical over sidereal, and that everybody knew about precession during the first years of the Christian era. That's very misleading because it assumes reasonable literacy, when it was very low in the West, a fairly high level of numeracy, exposure to previous works and an understanding of them, a mentor, stylus and paper, parchment, vellum, or papyrus, which was no small matter in those days, perhaps a quarterstaff or an astrolabe to measure angles, and some degree of awareness of what was really happening vis-a-vis the equinox and the ecliptic. Exceedingly few people had all of that, and in particular, the understanding of the disengagement between the sky and the ground, not to mention a good idea of solar system geometry that didn't exist until Copernicus, and which was much disputed even then in the 16th century CE. Babylon had become a ruin, barely inhabited, according to Strabo the geographer, whose dates are approximately 64 BCE to 21 CE, who visited the place in his lifetime. And except for Oxyrhynchus, a sidereal enclave in Egypt, there is no reason to assume that there was sidereal material available with which to compare tropical and sidereal. In the West, it was tropical or nothing. Worse, nobody understood precession until Newton, who addressed the matter in his Principia, published in 1686, but even he struggled with it. Nobody realized that tropical transits are skewed by precession by a full degree in a single lifetime because tropical ephemerides were too inaccurate to show it. Part of this problem is explained by Professor Alexander Jones in his masterpiece, Astronomical Papyri from Oxyrhynchus. Jones writes, quote, Ptolemy's longitudes are also professedly tropical, although his assumption of too long a value for the tropical year gives rise to a gradually increasing discrepancy between his 0 point and the true vernal point. The longitudes and the papyri, that is the Oxyrhynchus papyri, are usually counted from a sidereally fixed 0 point. A standard rule, Theon's formula, was used in antiquity to convert Ptolemy's longitudes to the sidereal frame of reference. End quote. I don't know if the Theon Jones mentioned is the Theon of the handy tables, but it's likely since Jones mentions the handy tables twice on the page that I just quoted. In any case, Ptolemy's accuracy is suspect, especially over time, which only deteriorated until by the 1460s, Johannes Müller, the great mathematician better known as Regiomontanus, found very serious problems with Ptolemaic astronomy, which translated into gross errors. Accurate astrology was not available until Kepler's Rudolphine tables were printed in 1627.
Astrologers then, from the 2nd century forward, have been using the tropical zodiac deliberately, and this includes a succession of different famous astronomers like, Kepler, Galileo, Copernicus, just like a succession of different famous astronomers in Western history were also astrologers and also used the tropical zodiac as their primary reference system for doing astrological calculations.
Again, Chris emphasizes that astrologers from the Roman imperial era through the modern period deliberately, consciously, and consistently chose to use tropical reckoning as if they were fully conversant with the difference between tropical and sidereal reckoning. That's not remotely true. Nobody really understood precession in the ancient world. A few people must have grasped that the sky didn't line up with the seasons several hundred years after Ptolemy, because they could see the sky and ground diverge with respect to the equinoxes. I don't know if there's anyone who commented about it before the Muslim astronomer and mathematician al-Battani in the 9th century CE, fully 7 centuries after Ptolemy's death. If astrology were practiced at a high level during the Dark Age in the West, the record has yet to be demonstrated. So if there's a voice as yet unheard from the intellectual hibernation of the West when tropical astrology was uncontested, it's mute and doesn't constitute support. Even more to the point, there was no sidereal standard in the West during the Dark Age or the current millennium until Cyril Fagan, an Irish astrologer, demonstrated in the 20th century that sidereal astrology had been the standard in the ancient world. Fagan was a long-time tropical astrologer who realized after 2 decades of study that the ancient world was sidereal until Greek influence was felt. He's one of a small handful in the first rank of Western astrologers of the modern era. Fagan was met by intense bitter, vitriolic resistance to almost everything he had to say about tropical and sidereal astrology in the relatively mild atmosphere of the 20th century, even though he was hands down the best interpreter of his era, still revered though he died 55 years ago. In the 16th and 17th centuries, people were still being killed and tortured for unorthodox views. Most scholars think that Copernicus waited to publish De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, in which he proposed the literal heresy that the Earth orbits the Sun, until he was 70, because the Church would not torture a septuagenarian. Giordano Bruno, who espoused the Copernican theory, was burned at the stake in Rome in 1600 for what were in effect thought crimes. Let there be no mistake, it wasn't merely torture. He had been tortured. He was burned alive to death. Bruno also said that the universe was infinite and that the stars were other suns. He was right, but that didn't save him or open any minds to his views. In 1633, Galileo was threatened with torture if he did not recant his advocacy of the Copernican theory. It was much more dangerous to espouse new ideas in the medieval world that veered toward the esoteric than today. That was especially true after the 12th century, with the rise of the Inquisition. Even without that undercurrent of fear, the degree of difficulty that presenting sidereal material would have entailed, especially as Akkadian and cuneiform were dead and ancestral to the Arabic spoken by Muslims who were despised in Europe in those days, precludes the possibility of any sort of choice between tropical and sidereal until recently. There was no conscious choice, though Chris keeps pushing that idea. The order of the day was uniformly tropical.
All right, so to bring this around, I just wanted to conclude this again by bringing it around to the baselessness of some of the skeptical attacks on tropical astrology, which is one, that there was a recent shift that has caused everyone's zodiac sign to be one sign off. No, that's not true, in the sense that if if Western astrologers have been deliberately defining the tropical zodiac in the context of the seasons for 2000 years, and if everybody in the West has grown up, let's say, resonating with their zodiac signs as defined by Western astrologers, the seasons don't change. The seasons haven't changed, and therefore the tropical signs of the zodiac have not changed, because that is a fixed reference system relative to the seasons. So it's misleading to say that everyone's sign is like one sign off.
Chris claims that it's not only baseless but absurd to criticize tropical reckoning, that to do so is even a nefarious attempt to mislead. He says that the signs are fixed with respect to the seasons, as if to leave the impression that the tropical zodiac is not actually moving with respect to the overarching element of astrology, the sky. But tropical reckoning is known as the moving zodiac because it continuously gets farther and farther removed from the sky by the day. Tropical reckoning caught on, not so much because of what Ptolemy wrote when the West was overwhelmingly illiterate, but because it was indisputable that the stars in Aries rose with the equinox. You could see it. Now tropical astrology is much more difficult to defend because Pisces rises with the equinox in an equally indisputable manner. But the tropical position is that the zodiac begins with the northern hemisphere vernal equinox. One is expected to ignore the sky and ignore that the northern hemisphere vernal equinox is the southern hemisphere autumnal equinox. The appearance from time to time of an article like the one that appeared in September 2025 is evidence of how weak those arguments are. If one were to buy the argument that tropical astrology is beyond criticism, one would be inclined to castigate, punish, ostracize, damn, and shun anyone for making the following true statements. 1. The Earth is not motionless. 2. The Earth is not the center of the universe. 3. The Earth does, in fact, rotate on its axis and revolve around the Sun. 4. The ecliptic is not moving, except by less than a half second of arc per year. 5. The celestial equator is moving at the rate of 50.23 seconds per year. 6. The zodiac refers to the stars, hence astrologos, the word or study of the stars. 7. The zodiac is not the seasons, which are constantly moving against the sky. 8. The Earth's spin axis precesses, and the celestial equator is connected to it, which makes the equinox move in relation to the sky, not the other way around. 9. In 11,000 years, the tropical zodiac will be completely upside down with respect to the stellar zodiac, which will be much harder to defend than it is now. In his concluding remarks, Chris says that the long run of tropical reckoning is a commendable thing in itself, as if the long run of 1,800 years confers legitimacy. In reply, I think it's noteworthy that the conviction that the world is flat also experienced a long run. I've noticed some astrologers quoting Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos in response to the New York Times article. The Tetrabiblos is about astrology and does not constitute a defense of the tropical zodiac in any way. Ptolemy's Almagest is about astronomy, which is at the heart of the issues I've commented on here. Ptolemy's Almagest is the book necessary to understand Ptolemy's positions addressed in this critique. Thank you for listening. I've made a written version of my remarks available on my website. You'll find that link below. My book, An Introduction to Western Sidereal Astrology, has 3 appendices, one of which deals with the exaltations. The bibliography in my book is likely to interest anyone who wants to study this topic.